And what we want to do tonight is continue our study of Solomon. And last Sunday night we talked about the preparations for building the temple. And tonight we're going to talk about building the temple itself. And there's several things you're going to find of interest here. We're going to look at it from 1 Kings chapter 6. But there's supplemental material in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, and I should have put chapter 4 in there. We're not going to go into details in chapter 4. I'm going to kind of summarize that. But we're going to look mostly at 1 Kings chapter 6 and then supplement some of this from what we read in the book of 2 Chronicles chapter 3. Well, here we go. And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. You might want to pay attention to those words, 480 years. That's going to take them 7 years to build this. In round numbers, you can just kind of think 500 years. 500 years. From the time that the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt and to the time that Solomon was reigning over Israel. It kind of gives you a time perspective now as we go through the chronology of the Scriptures. Just about 500 years. Here's 2 Chronicles 3, 1 and 2. It tells us a little different information. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem in Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared to David his father in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And he began to build in the 2nd day of the 2nd month, the 4th year of his reign. Well, you remember the story when David numbered the people and there was a pestilence over the land and the angel stood there at the threshing floor with his sword drawn over Jerusalem. And David said, "Not these people, take me instead of them." And the Lord told him to go up there and to offer sacrifice, and David bought that threshing floor. Now the fellow was willing to give it to David, but David said, "I'll not offer to the Lord that which would cost me nothing." And so he built the altar there, and now this is the mount upon which the temple is to be built. Back to 1 Kings chapter 6. And the house which Solomon built for the Lord, the length thereof was 60 cubits, the breadth thereof 20 cubits, and the height thereof 30 cubits. And the porch before the temple of the house, 20 cubits was the length thereof according to the breadth of the house, and 10 cubits was the breadth thereof to the length of the house. Well, how long is a cubit? The measure you'll usually come up with is 18 inches. It's essentially from the fingertip down to the elbow. I guess it depends on how big you are, what a cubit is. The other number you'll come across sometime is 21 inches. And I think that the ark in Kentucky is based on the 21-inch cubit instead of the 18-inch cubit. And I don't know how they know that or which one is really correct, but the numbers I consulted were of the 18-inch cubit here that we're talking about for Solomon's temple. And if you take a cubit to be 18 inches, that's a foot and a half. So you got it's 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, 45 feet high. That's kind of a strange shape, isn't it? The porch on it, then, this is sticking out from that would be 30 feet wide, the same width, 15 feet long. So the 90 and 15, that'd be 105 feet altogether. I thought, kind of put this in perspective. Gary came in here and measured our auditorium. Okay, so let's kind of think if we could bend the walls and expand this around, what do we got? Remember, this is 30 feet wide. This is not an excessively massive structure. This auditorium is right at 40 feet wide, 40 feet 7 inches. You take 10 feet off these walls, okay? It'll be about the middle of the the pews down through here. And that's how wide we're talking about. But now, how long is it? How long is it? Well, 90 feet long. This building here, Gary says 42 feet long. It would be twice as long as this building, and a little more than probably out to the foyer, and twice that would about be to give us 90 feet. So this is kind of giving you maybe a perspective. Now, how high? How high? Our ceiling is 11 feet high. This was 45 feet high. That'd be way up there, wouldn't it? I mean, about almost four times, it'd be 4 times as high as the ceiling. And so that'd be a very tall, narrow, long structure. Now, it wouldn't be excessively massive, but that kind of gives you the idea of what we're talking about. Now, going on. It says, the house that he made, so I think that's where we are, yeah. And for the house, he made windows of narrow slits. Well, we kind of got narrow slit windows, don't we? I think theirs may have been more narrow than that, but windows of narrow slits, and against the wall of the house, he built chambers round about against the wall of the house round about, both of the temple and of the oracle. Now, we'll get to the oracle here in just a moment. And he made chambers round about. So that would be like storage areas all around the outsides of the structure. Chambers. They would be areas for the priest to sleep, areas to store the equipment necessary to operate that temple. Okay, verse 6, the nethermost chamber was 5 cubits broad, and the middle was 6 cubits broad, and the third was 7 cubits broad. For without in the wall of the house he made narrow rest round about, that the beams should not be fastened in the walls of the house. Well, the beams across the top, they didn't rest on the walls. They'd rest on some pillars that were outside here so that the walls would be freestanding and the beams would rest up there. That's the way I'm imagining this. It's a little hard to look at this and think how all this works. And actually there's several different variations of interpretation about just how this ought to come together. But use your mind and try to think of how this structure may have looked. 1 Kings 6, and the house, when it was in building, was built of stone made ready before it was brought thither. They prepared the stones elsewhere and brought prepared stones to build the house and to show the skill at which they prepared those stones. There was neither hammer, nor axe, nor any tool of iron heard in the house while it was building. They made those stones where they would fit. Pre-constructed, brought together, and they could just fit them, and they didn't have to work on those stones to make them fit after they brought them into Jerusalem. Now, 8. The door for the middle chamber was in the right side of the house, and they went up winding stairs to the middle chamber, out of the middle into the third. So he built the house and finished it, and covered the house with beams and boards of cedar. And he built chambers against all the house, 5 cubits high. And they rested on the house with timbers of cedar. And now the Lord interjects. This is during the process of that house being built. The word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, concerning this house which thou art in building, if thou wilt walk in my statutes, and execute my judgments, and keep all my commandments to walk in them, then I will perform my word with thee, which I spake unto David thy father, and I will dwell among the children of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel. Sort of a warning there, but also a reassurance that God's approving of Solomon and what he is doing here. Well, let's get back to the building. So Solomon built the house and finished it. And he built the walls of the house within with boards of cedar, both the floor of the house and the walls of the ceiling, and he covered them on the inside with wood and covered the floor of the house with planks of fir. So it's built to stone, but covered in wood. And he built 20 cubits on the side of the house, both the floor and the walls with the boards of the cedar. And he built them for it within, even for the oracle. Now here's your oracle. Even for the most holy place. An oracle. An oracle is a thing spoken. And the way the temple's constructed, you had the outside of the temple, and that's where the sacrifices were made. But before the priest would enter into the temple, they would wash themselves in the basins that were outside. And we're going to see there was a huge basin outside, big enough for them to immerse themselves into. And they would offer their sacrifices for themselves and cleanse themselves and then come into the temple. And that's where the golden candlesticks would be, and the table of showbread and the altar of incense. And then once a year, the high priest would take the altar of incense, this is on the Day of Atonement, from the holy place in the temple back behind the curtain to the most holy place. And that was where the Ark of the Covenant would be. Over the Ark of the Covenant was the mercy seat. Within the Ark of the Covenant was a copy of the 10 Commandments that were made in stone. It's just interesting, isn't it, how that the mercy seat would cover the law. Angels were formed to be upon the Ark of the Covenant called cherubims. They were guardian angels. And on the ark, their wings would stretch out on either side of that ark, and they would touch each other, and their faces were turned down, as though they're looking down at the mercy seat. I think Peter alludes to this in 1 Peter, when he talks about that kind of salvation, which angels desired to look into. And then once that year, God would let His presence be known above the mercy seat between those cherubims. That is where He spoke to Moses. And Moses would come out with his face shining when they were in the tabernacle in the wilderness. That was the oracle. And so we're talking about there the most holy place, the place of the oracle. Now let's keep reading this. And the house, that is the temple before it, was 40 cubits long. And the cedar of the house within was carved with knops and open flowers. All was cedar. There was no stone seen. And the oracle he prepared in the house within, and set there the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and the oracle in the forepart. Now notice this. 20 cubits in length, 20 cubits in breadth, and 20 cubits in height. That most holy place had the dimensions of a cube. 20 by 20 by 20. Well, convert that 30 foot by 30 foot by 30 foot. That would be that cube. Several times now in the visions of the prophets, you're going to read about a building that has a cube all the way to the end of Revelation. The city, remember, 4 square, shaped as a cube. And you need to think back on this most holy place where God let His presence be known in Israel in that oracle, the place of the oracle. And it was overlaid with pure gold, and so covered the altar, which was of cedar. So Solomon overlaid the house within with pure gold. And he made a partition by the chains of gold before the oracle, and he overlaid it with gold. And the whole house he overlaid with gold until he'd finished all the house. Also the whole altar that was by the oracle he covered with gold. That would be the altar of incense. And within the oracle he made 2 cherubims of olive tree, each 10 cubits high. Now you had the cherubim over the ark, but then he made 2 more. 15 feet tall, angels, guardian angels, on either side of the Ark of the Covenant. And it's a little difficult to see how they're placed and all. Well, let me read this and see if you can imagine it. It says, and 5 cubits was the one wing of the cherub, and 5 cubits was the other wing of the cherub. From the uttermost part of one wing unto the uttermost part of the other were 10 cubits, and the other cherub was 10 cubits. Both the cherubs were of one measure and one size. The height of the one cherub was 10 cubits, and so it was of the other cherub. And he set the cherubs within the inner house, and they stretched forth the wings of the cherubs, so that the wings of the one touched the one wall, and the wing of the other cherub touched the other wall, and their wings touched one another in the midst of the house, and he overlaid the cherubs with gold. Well, you can Google this and look at images if you want to. You'll find several representations of what this might have looked like. But maybe the one in your mind right now is probably the best one for you to focus on. If you can imagine what those guardian angels, those images of guardian angels about the ark, how that would have appeared. Now, 1 Kings chapter 6, 29. And he carved all the walls of the house round about with carved figures of cherubims and palm trees and open flowers within and without. And the floors of the house he overlaid with gold within and without. And for the entering of the oracle he made doors of olive tree. The lintel and the side post of it were a fifth part of the wall. The 2 doors also were of olive tree. And he carved upon them carvings of cherubims and palm trees and open flowers, and overlaid them with gold, and spread gold upon the cherubims and upon the palm trees. And so he made for the door of the temple post of olive tree, a 4th part of the wall. And the 2 doors were of fig fir trees. The leaves of the one door were folding, and the 2 leaves of the other door were folding. And he carved thereon cherubims and palm trees and open flowers, and covered them with gold fitted upon the carved work. And he built the inner court with 3 rows of hewed stone and a row of cedar beams. Now, if you can imagine all that, you've done pretty good. But even if you can't, you get the idea. This was a glorious place with all the stone covered with cedar and all the cedar covered with gold. Let me look at some supplemental material. In 2 Chronicles chapter 3, in verse 6, it says, he garnished the house with precious stones for beauty. And the gold was the gold of Parvium. Well, I don't know what Parvium is, but it must have been a very special, fine, pure gold. But look at the precious stones. Not only was all this covered with gold, but set within them would be these precious stones, garnished with precious stones, to bring out the beauty of this temple. Down in verse 14, 2 Chronicles 3:14. He made a veil of blue and purple and crimson and fine linen, and wrought cherubims thereon. Must have been some kind of needle point or something that they put on this veil. And he made also of the house 2 pillars of 30 and 5 cubits high, and the chapter that was on the top of each one was 5 cubits. And he made chains as in the oracle, and put them on the heads of the pillars, and made 100 pomegranates, and put them on the chains. And he reared up the pillars before the temple, one on the right hand, the other on the left. And he called the name of that one on the right hand Jachin, and the name of the other Boaz. You come up to that temple, I want you to see the 2 pillars out front. 2 tall pillars. And they're named. And the name Jachin means he shall establish. The name Boaz, in it is strength. And so that was what they named those two pillars. And then 2 Chronicles 4. I'm not going to go into the details of that chapter, but you may want to read it. It gives you the details of how they made the altar, the molten sea of brass. That molten sea of brass was on the backs of 12 oxen, 3 by 3 by 3 by 3. And this molten sea of brass set upon them. And it says that there were 10 lavers. That would be a basin to wash your hands in. 10 lavers, 10 candlesticks, 10 tables, and pots and shovels and basins and flesh hooks and vessels and lamps and tongs and spoons and censers. Now it describes all these in some detail in that chapter. One of the things that interested me is how they made them. See if you find it when you read the chapter. They went out where the ground was of clay, and they would mold these things out of the clay and then pour the molten material into the clay to form these different implements that they would use in the management then of that temple. And you can tell by the pots and shovels and basins and flex hooks and basins and lamps and tongs and spoons and censers. Sounds like the kind of thing you would need for a sacrifice, doesn't it, on the altar. And so that's what these things would be used for. Let's go back to 1 Kings chapter 6. In the 4th year was the foundation of the house of the Lord laid in the month Ziph. And in the 11th year, in the month Bul, which is the 8th month, was the house finished throughout all the parts thereof, and according to all the fashion of it. So he was 7 years in building it. They were very meticulous, weren't they? How they went about to construct this temple. That's a picture of what some think it may have looked like when it was finished. As I read that and looked at this picture, it brought up some questions to me. There were some other pictures, and if you want to get some different ideas about what people think this may have looked like, then you can do what I did. Just Google it, type in Solomon's Temple, go to images, and you'll just have a page full of different depictions of how people have interpreted what this might have looked like. I thought this was pretty good. You see the big lather basin, the molten sea that sits on those 12 oxen over there off to the right, don't you? You see the altar over there with the smoke coming up from it, and it doesn't show it here, but on another there'd be steps going up to the altar. You see the 2 pillars that were there at the front that we were talking about, and the veil that is hanging, and it's a very tall structure. It looks like it's too wide there to me. I think it was more narrow than that. But you do see the chambers round about the outside of it. And so that's something like that is what Solomon's temple must have looked like. Now, let's go to 1 Chronicles chapter 28. Before Solomon had built this, while David, his father, was still alive, David had given Solomon some instruction. And in 1 Chronicles 28:10, David's talking to Solomon, and he says, "Take heed now, for the Lord hath chosen thee to build an house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it." Then David gave to Solomon his son the pattern. He had a blueprint. He had some instructions. Solomon didn't just build this temple any way he wanted to. When we read what Solomon was doing, now we understand why he's doing what he's doing. He's following the instructions that were given to him by his father, the pattern. David gave him the pattern of the porch and of the houses thereof and of the treasuries thereof and of the upper chambers thereof and of the inner parlors thereof and of the place of the mercy seat and the pattern of all that he had by the Spirit. The Spirit gave David the pattern. And Solomon took that pattern that came from his Father, but ultimately came from the Spirit. And that's how he built the temple. And the pattern of all that he had by the Spirit of the courts of the house of the Lord, and of all the chambers round about, and of the treasuries of the house of God, and of the treasuries of the dedicated things, also for the courses of the priests and the Levites, and all the work of the service of the house of the Lord, and for all the vessels of the service in the house of the Lord. 1 Chronicles 28:19. Look at this. All this, said David, the Lord made me to understand in writing by his hand upon me, even all the works of this pattern. David could have told Saul, I felt the hand of the Lord on me when I put it down in writing how this was to be built. This comes from the Spirit. This is what God wants you to do. And he gives this to Solomon, and he expects Solomon to be able to read what he had put down in writing and to follow those instructions in order to build that temple in the way that God wanted it built. A very similar thing had occurred in the wilderness when it came to the tabernacle in the wilderness. And we could go back to Exodus and find that and dig it all out, but I went on to the New Testament. It tells us in Hebrews 8 in verse 5, Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle, for see, saith he, that thou make all things according to the pattern shown thee in the mount. But when Moses made the tabernacle in the wilderness, he didn't come up with this. God told him how he wanted it done. And Moses followed God's instructions. He took that pattern and built it the way God wanted it built. And then the Spirit comes to David and said, you're going to build a temple? Let me put my hand on you while you write this down. This is how it's going to be. And David writes it down and hands it to his son Solomon. Solomon reads what David had written, the construction details, how to build this. And then he follows the pattern in having it built. And it took him 7 years to get it done. But he got it done right. Now, let's go back to 1 Kings chapter 6. And this may have some bearing then on these words that we see in verses 11 through 13, where the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, concerning this house which thou art in building, if thou wilt walk in my statutes, and execute my judgments, and keep all my commandments, to walk in them, I'll perform my words with thee, which I spake to David thy father, and I dwell among the children of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel. You see, Solomon knew what he was supposed to. He wasn't to deviate from the pattern. Oh, there's all kind of symbolism involved in this tabernacle, and then in this temple. And it was important that it was done the right way so it would teach the right lessons. And in Hebrews, some of this is explained. You see, the high priest would take the sacrifice and put it on the altar. And offering that sacrifice, he would cleanse himself in that molten sea and go into the holy place. And there would be the light of the golden candlesticks. And there would be the table of showbread. And there would be the altar of incense. And one day a year, the high priest, he'd take that altar of incense and carry it with him into the room of the oracle, the most holy place, and meet with God at the mercy seat. You come to the New Testament, and Christ is our high priest. And He offers Himself as that sacrifice. And we're to be the ones that are washed in those waters of baptism and enter into His church. And that's where we walk in the light of His Word. And that's where we feed and are nourished by the bread of life. And here's where we offer our prayers unto God. And someday we'll pass through the veil and meet with God on His throne. Now, Moses didn't understand all that. And David didn't understand all that. And Solomon didn't understand all that. And the text says the angels desired to look into these things. But it's revealed to us in the New Testament the significance of God's pattern. God makes a pattern for the tabernacle. God makes a pattern for the temple. And these are types of the church that He's going to establish. And yet He'd come to His church and say, well, you don't have a pattern, just do what you want to. No. God lays it out in the New Testament. In fact, Paul told Timothy that you teach according to the pattern of sound words which you have heard of me. Timothy, don't go out there and study up something and have great insights and come up with your own ideas and teach that. No. I've given you the pattern of what you're to teach. You teach according to the pattern that you have heard from me. And if you follow that pattern, you'll build God's church. He tells us about how to organize it with elders and deacons. He tells His church when He wants them to assemble for worship. He tells them to partake of the Lord's Supper and the emblems and what that is to represent. He tells us about giving on the first day of the week and teaches us to worship Him in song. And He shows us what to teach and tells us to admonish one another. It's not for us to say, look at that and say, well, yeah, that's good, but this is the way I want to do it. And then come up with our own pattern. Look what God said to Solomon. Walk in my statutes. Execute my judgments. Keep all my commandments. Perform my word. Solomon, you got it in writing. I expect you to read what is written and follow the pattern. And if we'll read what is written and follow the pattern for God's church, then the church will be the church of Christ. I know that's ridiculed sometimes as pattern theology. But if you have a problem with pattern theology, let me take you back to 1 Kings 11 through 13 and see what God said about that. Follow the pattern. Now, we've got the pattern of how to be saved. We've got example after example in the book of Acts. It's a pattern you can follow. And you put all that's said together. We're to hear the word of the Lord. And then we're to trust Him, put faith in what we have heard, and turn from every other way that we may have been following. That's repentance. And confess His name before men. Be baptized into Christ. Come up out of that water, a new creature, and live according to what is written. There's the pattern. And then someday we'll pass through that veil and meet with God. Well, great lessons we can learn from the Old Testament. I'm going to follow this up again at least one more week. We may not get through Solomon. I'm not sure, but I'm thinking Bradley's got some information for us on Christian evidences. So we may kind of draw a halt here after we get through the next chapter or two. Let Bradley teach Sunday nights for a while on some Christian evidence material that he's had from a class he's been taking at Freed Hardeman University, and I want to hear that. And then if we have time toward the end of summer, we'll pick this back up before we get back into Bible Bowl season and start there. If you need to respond to the invitation tonight, you have that chance to do it as we stand and sing.